members of Pune International Center, some of the academic institutions that are institutional member of Pune International Center, and a few corporate members as well. As we have kept this program open for all to attend, we also have some keen Punekars who have always participated in PIC programs and benefited from it. I would also welcome some of the journalists who have joined the program today and are listening to it. I'm not going to take much time. I'm just going to straight away hand it over to Dr. Mashelkar. But before that, let me just mention the flow of the program today. We'll first have opening remarks by President of Pune International Center, Dr. Mashelkar. Then we'll have address by Dr. Suhas Palshikar. We'll have question and answer. Then we'll have concluding remarks by Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Vice President of National Center. Then I'll come back to propose the vote of thanks. With that, now I hand it over to President of Pune International Center, Dr. Mashelkar. Sir.
Thank you very much indeed, Prashant. I want to, on behalf of Pune International Center, extend to you all a very, very warm welcome. This is a virtual meeting which has become a new norm. I remember the last Foundation Day, and on that day, if somebody had told me, what would this Foundation Day be, this year be, 2020 be, or 24 September be, I would not have believed it. We have had 100 families, 100 million families move from poverty to extreme poverty in just 100 days. We have had 400 million people go jobless in just 100 days. We have had 1.6 billion children go out of school, and home has become their school in just 100 days. The loss of lives, the loss of livelihoods is incredible. And the recession is on cards, and we really have challenges before us for just not recovering, but reinventing ourselves. But I have the reputation of being a dangerous optimist. I'm quite sure with the human spirit that we have, we will rebound. I want to extend our very best wishes on behalf of the Pune International Center for your well-being. Please keep safe. Please keep well, you and your beloved families. I mentioned about the 10 years of glorious journey of Pune International Center. Dada, you are there in the frame. I still remember that meeting that we had in NCL conference room, where you were there, Mr. B.G. Deshmukh was there, Mohan Daria was there. They are no more, and there were so many others. And we all thought of this idea of creating a Vichar Manthan Kendra, and I still remember what we said. We said in 1920s, we had Tilak, Agarkar, Ranade, Gokhale, and Pune was really a thought leader at that time, a leader. And we said 100 years later, we have to create that. This was 1920s, this is 2020. And I'm very proud to say that Pune International Center is exactly that, a leading Vichar Manthan Kendra, I would say. We have 420 members in our family now. We have 54 institutional members. Some of the most important, some of the most eminent institutions are our members. We have programs. We work in the policy space. We have people who have dedicated themselves to Pune International Center with a fantastic spirit of making Pune a leading thought leader. I must say that our models are very simple. We, of course, deliberate, then we deliver, let's say, a policy paper, we engage, and then we influence. This is the simple model that we have. And I must acknowledge our beloved Vice President, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, who really is the force behind this center. not only fountainhead of ideas, but a very forceful action leader. And he has created a great public policy research space for Pune International Center, which has become his brand. And we are working in different areas like national security, social innovation, energy, environment, climate change, urbanization and economic reforms, emerging technologies, national innovation ecosystem, and so on. And we are influencing both at the center and the state level. For example, at the center level, this year, our contribution to new education policy, our contribution to creating the new models of social entrepreneurship in the country, and our contributions in a variety of different ways are very noteworthy. And it is not that we are just suppliers of ideas. You know, lately, Pune International Center stands for trust. States trust us, nation trusts us, people trust us. So I'm very proud to say, for example, recently, the Defense Ministry approached us for doing a study on a very critical strategic issue. I can't get into the details, but it was so wonderful that they look at us as great thought leader in diverse areas. At a state level, we are making a difference. Particularly, I want to mention the state of Maharashtra. Our Honorable Chief Minister Uddhavji Thackeray, he got engaged with us early in the year, and he said that Pune International Center must become a think tank for Maharashtra. And I remember in the COVID crisis, we have given number of policy papers, which and many of those ideas are getting executed. In fact, he has taken a personal leadership. In fact, he had a meeting about a month ago with himself, the Deputy Chief Minister, the Chief Secretary, and all others, and we talked about certain action points. And it is rather remarkable that today history was created that the Chief Secretary had a meeting with all his key secretaries, with a team led by none other than Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Deepak Parekh, and all others, to talk about certain critical issues in terms of actions. So it is not only influencing, it is influencing the action, so as to say. And they had a discussion this afternoon, just 3 hours ago, on employment-led growth by looking at particularly the real estate sector, ease of doing business, attracting foreign investment, and new industrial growth opportunity. Not only that, this is going to get into a system where there will be sort of this action taken forward. I must also say that our influence is coming in many different ways. It is not just our programs, policies, but even the persons. Basically, we have some of the most eminent thought leaders. And therefore, you will see post-COVID or in the COVID era, you have seen the editorials, the op-eds, the television interviews, and some of you might have seen the latest by Gautam Bambawale with Kiran Thapa. And you must have heard Dr. Vijay Gokhale's interviews, as well as Dada, he gave the Symbiosis Golden Jubilee talk, which was so fantastic. So we are creating that influence, as I say, through programs, through policy, as well as our people. Now, let's not forget that Pune International Center, as Dilip Padgakar always used to remind us, it is International Center in Pune. So we are creating an international imprint. For example, just last February, we had this Asia Economic Dialogue, where 8 countries participated. We had 40 plus distinguished speakers from Asian, European, and American, and Ambassador Bambawale, of course, led from front. And this is going to be a regular feature. So we really appreciate and thank the Ministry of Economic Affairs for the confidence that they have in relying on us to conduct India's sort of flagship program, and that trust sort of continues. As I mentioned, we have had no break in our programs. COVID came and a number of things were stopped, but not PIC program, by the way. In fact, we are more active. We are super active during that time. Somehow or the other, we have this ability to use adversity to create new opportunities, which we have actually given. And of course, our flagship programs like Pune Development National, Pune Dialogue on National Security or National Social Innovation Conference, etc., they continue. But there are newer and newer programs that are being introduced. Like some of you, just a few days ago, must have seen the inauguration of a new series, Ambassador Speaks, and the French ambassador spoke. And I must thank Ambassador Vijay Gokhale for enabling it, for championing it, for spearheading it. And this is going to be a major feature of our internationalization. Then you just saw, just 4 days ago, Science for Society, Dr. Shekhar Mande, an iconic leader today, telling us during just last 100 days how the scientific community has risen to the COVID challenge, and CSR in, of course, particular. And we are starting with a new series now where CM speaks. The chief ministers of different states will speak. And I'm delighted that our own chief minister from Maharashtra, Shri Uddhav Thackeray, is going to be the first speaker. And he's going to talk about, what subject? Federalism. It's very interesting that he's going to talk on that, and that will be the inaugural. And this is a prelude in a way, because today we have Dr. Suhas Palshikar talk to us about majoritarianism of future democratic politics in India. I'm a great admirer of Dr. Palshikar. To me, he's one of our foremost political analysts, one of our foremost political commentator. I have personally learned myself from his writing, from his speeches. And Dr. Palshikar, I was going through some of your speeches this morning, and I saw the 3rd January one, where the tagline to your lecture was a very evocative one, saying what the new government needs to do so that we don't have to write the obituary of Indian democracy. So you mean what you say, you are bold, and that's what makes you special. And in that article, of course, you have talked about the institutional autonomy, the rule of law, the democratic things in the dialogue, not force, nationality, and so on and so forth. And your last point was majoritarianism. Okay, so and that is the issue that we are going to sort of take up. So we are very grateful to you for accepting our invitation, and we really look forward to next inspiring 60 minutes. Thank you very much, Prashant.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. It was brilliant to hear on all that we have tried to do over the last year, and how we also began. Thank you so much, sir, for that. Before I request Professor Palshikar, let me attempt something that's not very easy, and that's trying to introduce Professor Palshikar. I'm not going to read the entire CV, but allow me to just say a couple of lines. Professor Suhas Palshikar is an Indian academic and social and political scientist. He's somebody who has delivered, who has been a professor in Pune University for close to 3 decades, and thousands of students, right, who studied in Professor Palshikar's classes, or those who didn't even enroll there but came and freely attended some of those classes, vouch for the fact that how much they got to learn from Professor Palshikar. The other thing is about his writing that Dr. Mashelkar also mentioned. We all learned from it, sir. Professor Palshikar has written over hundreds of articles and essays in popular Marathi and English journals and dailies. He is regular contributor in both international and national journals, books, magazines, and popular newspapers. Apart from other important positions that he has held throughout his academic career, most lately, Professor Palshikar was also professor at Brown India Initiative in the Brown University. He has been teaching courses on political sociology, Indian politics, Indian political party system, political economy of India, and political process in Maharashtra. We have had the opportunity to listen to Professor Palshikar on an occasion or two over the last 9 years. And on every occasion, the tiny issue that we had in administration was never had enough space, irrespective of which hall we had booked. Fortunately, sir, that's one less issue this time because it's digital, and bring them on is what we said, like, let more the merrier. So that's about that. Let me now take an opportunity to mention the subject. Professor Palshikar will talk to us about majoritarianism and the future of democratic politics in India. Professor Palshikar, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Prashant, and thank you, Dr. Mashelkar, for those kind words. It's indeed a great pleasure, as always, to be in the midst, though this time it is in the virtual midst of all the stalwarts of the Pune International Center, mainly because of the perseverance of Dr. Vijay Kedkar and Prashant. I have had quite a few opportunities to mix with you without much authority or much standing in the realms of public policy as such. So thank you. I am aware that this lecture, being the foundation lecture of the PIC, holds special importance for the members of the PIC, and therefore I must begin by not only thanking the organization for having me speak, but also congratulating, because Pune does require many things, and one of those things that Pune requires in order to be a true metropolis is a think tank. And that is something which the Pune International Center has been consistently trying for over a decade to compensate for. I look forward to being associated with the center in the future also. So thank you very much. The topic of this afternoon, as Prashant read out, is about Indian democracy, but it is also about one particular aspect of Indian democracy which has evolved over a period of time and which might have repercussions for the future of India's democracy. As most of us are aware, democracy has many paradoxes. One of the paradoxes of democracy is that while majority is an operational tool of democracy, at the same time, many Democrats themselves are extremely always suspicious of what this majority means. In particular, what happens if democracy is reduced only to the idea of majority? So while on the one hand, majority is an important tool, we can't reduce democracy to only majorities. But further still, if that majority happens to be a majority of only one particular group or community within the society, then what happens to democracy? That is the beginning of this paradox that I am going to talk about. In a sense, therefore, we may say that democratic politics tends to succumb to community majorities in many societies. In a sense, India, which we will be discussing at length, is not an exception. There is always this susceptibility as far as democracy is concerned. And we are currently at a point at which India's democracy is facing not just one but many challenges. And my proposition would be that majoritarianism will be an important key challenge that India might be facing over the next. Before we proceed, a little couple of minutes about this term majoritarianism that I am using. Those who study democracy are aware that this term historically in literature on democracy has had a very simple meaning, a tendency of democracy to believe that majority is always right and therefore to over rely on that majority. But that was a political majority. So historically, the democratic theory that dealt with majoritarianism as an idea or as a stumbling block dealt with only political majorities. I am using the term majoritarianism in a more specific sense, which refers to the majority of a particular community within the political society, within democracy. I have been using this term for past decade and a half. And in a sense, I should be happy, but I am actually extremely to say that lately this word has become more commonplace in discussions of Indian politics. I would have been happier if Indian politics as well as students of Indian politics had junked this word altogether. So it is not a very happy occasion for me to say that something that I have been using has now become fashionable to use in analysis of Indian politics. But there are some slight differences of nuances also. For example, some scholars have been using the term ethnic majority instead of mere majoritarianism. Pradeep Chibur, for example, uses the term ethnic majoritarianism. And the obviously comes also from ethnic democracy, a term which a famous Israeli scholar, Sami Smuha, has been using for over last 10 and more years. Many India scholars have also adopted the term ethnic nationalism, ethnic democracy, ethnic majoritarianism, etc., including Christoph Jaffarlo, for example. The reason why I don't use the term ethnic majoritarianism is twofold. One is I don't understand the word ethnic. I have never understood. Having come from North Atlantic universes, I have always found difficulty with the meaning of the term ethnic and ethnicity. I think that it doesn't apply to most of the world. And in political theorization, I believe that things that don't apply to most of the world should be abandoned. So I don't use the word ethnic. The other reason why I don't use it is because the initial meaning of majoritarianism, namely political majority, has in a sense become more or less redundant now. And everyone, not only in India but elsewhere also, understands, and as I shall elaborate in a minute, the meaning of majoritarianism obviously refers to the majority of a particular community and the claims arising out of that. So let us straight away come not to semantics, not to labels, but to what I mean by majoritarianism. So what is majoritarianism that I am going to talk about? I shall postulate 4 or 5 principles which constitute the politics of majoritarianism. To begin with, a majority community invokes numbers. A community which is in plural or in numerous numbers in a given society invokes its numbers. It employs the majority principle to claim that it has right over shaping the social and political arena. So here you have a community which is one among the many communities in a given society, but happens to be the most numerous community, and it claims that it has a right to shape the social and political arena of a given society. Now, obviously, this also means that there is a right which is both de facto and de jure. The community might already have that right de facto and would want to make it convert it into de jure, something that Israel has managed to do. But what is even more important is that in this majoritarian claim, there are claims over almost everything. The community makes claims over symbols and says that its symbols should be the symbols of entire society. It would claim that its culture would be the culture of the entire society. History, it would say that its own understanding and interpretation of history would be the history of that society. In a sense, it is this ownership of a given community, a society, ownership over a given politics that is claimed, and therefore then there are claims over space, physical, geographical space, that this land belongs to us, or there are claims over power and claims over resources. If I went into giving examples, I might run into controversies and I also might run short of time. But just quickly, you can imagine a community in Bengaluru saying, for example, that Bengaluru belongs to Kannadigas, those who speak Kannada language. And therefore, those who don't speak Kannada should be outsiders and therefore either thrown out. They might not throw them out in the Arabian Sea because Arabian Sea is far too away from them. But in any case, this idea that the outsider lives here at our mercy on our terms or either becomes us. The outsider becomes an insider on our conditions, on our terms. That is majoritarianism as a political tendency. Therefore, then secondly, the second principle comes in. The challenge before all majoritarian politics is to actually construct that majority and convey it into politics. Politics is always slippery. Politics is always divisive. And therefore, you might have the majority of a given community, but that community unfortunately might get politically divided. So the majoritarian project then is to bring them together, homogenize them. Homogenization of a given community, bringing it together and telling that community, look, you might have these differences, but they are secondary. Over and above that, you are XYZ. So be united as XYZ, as a particular community. That is the process of homogenization. In India, we always know and take pride in the fact that we have multiple hats to wear or multiple identities to show, and the context decides our identity. So when I go to Delhi, I become a Marathi person. When we travel abroad, we become Indians. But when I come back to Pune and talk to other people, I might even go back to my roots and say that this is my native city, that is my native village, and so on and so forth. Now, it is this overlapping structure of identity which majoritarians don't accept and agree with. They instead say that there is a hierarchy of identities. These are smaller identities, and one particular identity is the supreme identity. Hold on to that, belong to that, so that then you become true member of the identity. In a sense, it is this political structuring of a pan identity, whether it is pan Marathi or pan Christian, but bringing all those constituents together is the important aspect of majoritarian politics. Thirdly, and this is famously commented upon by everyone practically studying these politics, is in order to succeed in this politics, majoritarianism naturally turns to othering, that is, distinguishing the others who are not us. And that distinction is based on a very simple, though not very logical, but extremely emotional and therefore evocative principle that someone is turned out to be a villain. Someone is turned into a villain. So the other is a villain. Whatever problems I may face in my life and in my society here, they are because of something or someone else, not because of something that is wrong with me or my community, but the other. This villainization, historically, in all such societies where majoritarian politics has happened, and Sami Smuha, for example, would show how in Israel, every evil can be ascribed to the Arabs. It is this villainization, for example, which helps in constructing a democracy or a non-democracy on the basis of a majoritarian principle. Number 4, as a corollary of this villainization, obviously once you have constructed the bad, you have to construct the good, the ironically, in all majoritarian politics is always pictured, painted, projected as a victim. So there is always this story of victimhood, that we are majority, but we are the victims, that we have been at a disadvantage, that an injustice has been done us because of something historically. So it is this sense of injury where, and as you would realize, this sense of injury and the sense of victimhood would always have somewhere some element of truth. It cannot always be pursued, but it is the narrative which gets constructed, important for our purposes, that a wound is always there. In majoritarianism, the majority always carries a wound. 25 years ago, and even today, I guess, if you talked to a Sinhala person in Sri Lanka, an average Sinhala person in Sri Lanka, the standard narrative would be that we Sinhalas, our language is backward, we don't have opportunities, these Tamils are taking all the opportunities. might not be entirely false. The Tamils, at least one section of the Tamils, might be doing a little better. But this universal sense of injury of the Sinhala in Sri Lanka is typical of the story of victimhood. That story might happen in India, that story might happen in Malaysia, that story might happen in today's United States, for example, as I shall be later. So this victimhood is the fourth element of majoritarianism. Finally, politically, majoritarianism sincerely believes that the majority community is the natural protector of something. And that something is obviously our culture, our nation, or our region. Majoritarianism, I must say in parenthesis, is not only about religion. It can be about language, it can be about region. And therefore, the protagonist of majoritarianism of that something, that is a repository which the protagonist is protecting. And therefore, the politics of majoritarianism, militant or otherwise, will always be obsessed with this idea of protecting the honor of my country, protecting the honor of my region, protecting the honor of my religion, and so on and so forth. It is this instinct to protect which is the driver of majoritarian politics. And I must also add here, before I proceed, that this majoritarianism, for an outsider, one who is not a subscriber to the majoritarian viewpoint, sometimes appears to be only strategic. I am not looking at majoritarianism in this cynical manner, because while the cynics would piggyback on majoritarianism always often, the fact remains that majoritarianism is a serious political cultural project. And therefore, both the proponents and the propagators, the supporters and the leaders, believe in these tenets of majoritarianism. So, this is what I am talking about in the Indian context of the present moment. We are talking of majoritarianism. Democracy, paradoxically, always also have the other of majoritarianism. And in fact, democracy takes pride in doing that, in having that, and that is diversity. There is obviously, therefore, a relationship of tension between majoritarians and the question of diversity. All over the world, and as societies become more and more diverse, democracies face this problem of diversity. And I'm calling it problem. Increasing, more and more Democrats treat diversity as a problem rather than as an asset. Those of you who follow a little bit of liberal political theory, etc., would know that the current answer to the question of diversity, which is a very fashionable and influential answer, is known as multiculturalism. So diversity is handled through the prism of multiculturalism. But there is a problem here in multiculturalism, and that problem pertains to us in India, therefore I will mention it, which is that multiculturalism, at least in part, presupposes the original, that some people are the original inhabitants. There are the French, there are the English, and then there are the others, but somehow we have to deal with these others. So in multiculturalism, there is this distancing between the insider and the outsider, which we cannot escape. And I shall come back in a minute why, therefore, multiculturalism doesn't apply to India. The other answer, which is often given, which is not very different from this multiculturalism, but an evocative image from the United States, and that is the melting pot imagery. That everyone sort of assimilates, melts into the American way or the Australian way for that matter. Now look, both US or Australia have had certain historical accidental advantages, as a result of which they could create a new Australian way or the American way, and then everybody could be expected to sort of amalgamate into it or assimilate into it. Let us call melting pot, therefore, as a strategy of willing subsumption, that I subsume myself into the larger American cauldron without any complaint, without any force. And there have been debates in USA whether really there was willingness or there was a kind of superficial willingness. But let us leave it at that, because we know that even the melting pot hits a dead end sometimes, occasionally, and again. Second World War came and the melting pot hit a problem in the form of the Japs, as they were called then, derogatorily in the United States. 9/11 comes and Muslims become a problem in this melting pot, even if they sort of subsume themselves, and if they particularly do not, then they become more problematic. Now, of course, the Mexicans in the current regime. So even the melting pot is not without its problems, but that's the other answer which is given. Let us now model it and come back to India and how India has a particular problem of diversity or a particular beautiful structure of diversity. As I said earlier, it is this mosaic-like structure of India's identities and India's various cultural manifestations, which has historically been an asset for India. And therefore, let us be very clear about this, that either multicultural or the melting pot similes or analogies don't apply to India, for the simple reason that multiple identities in India have indigenous origins. They have not come from outside. And syncretism has been such a forceful player in India historically that even if something had come from the outside, it would be very difficult to identify it, because it would be part and at the same time it would be outside. Even the so-called and infamous problem of the Urdu language, many people don't know that it is not an outside language, but something that emerged here out of the syncretic tradition of India. And therefore, the larger point then is that India's multiple identities are native of their origin. And therefore, you cannot simply say that we want to make an arrangement between the insiders and the outsiders. What is more important, however, is our history of past 2 centuries, roughly from the 19th century onwards, where nationalism and democracy have handled in a very different and innovative way the Indian question of diversity. For example, nationalism. In the case of India's nationalism, there never was a precondition that in order to be an Indian national, you have to give up something else. You don't. You just remain what you are, and then you become an Indian national also. So there was no quid pro quo. There was no precondition that you give up this, adopt this, then you become a true Indian national. This logic did not apply to Indian nationalism of the past 2 centuries as it evolved through the colonial era. The same is true of India's democracy. Late 19th, early 20th century onwards, the march of democracy began in this country, not formally, but informally. But since the time it began, democracy always put emphasis on negotiation rather than exclusion, of give and take, deliberation rather than dissolution of identities. The studies of India's federalism and structural sense, but in the process sense, are legendary, which have shown how India and India's democracy went to any extent to make compromises rather than breaking people's identities. So both nationalism and democracy have been the bulwark through which we negotiated and lived with our diversities. It is this diversity which has prompted many scholars later on to argue and point out that, and this term again comes from United States, that the model that India has is that of salad bowl rather than melting pot. That you distinctly keep your identities and yet become part of the whole. So there is no dissonance, there is no disconnect, but at the same time, there is no dissolution. So without dissolving, you connect. Without dissolving, and therefore without losing yourself, you win and add on something to your identity. That is the logic that has been followed in the Indian context. Obviously, this did not go without contestation. This logic of the salad bowl never went without contestation. And the contestation is also 100 years old, if not more. So right from the beginning of the 20th century, there has been this discomfort about diversity. Somehow, for 100 years, this idea has lurked in minds of some people at least, and some groups at least, that we need to search for uniformity so that we can be more and better united. So uniformity then becomes a lever with which you unite. And therefore the search for uniformity then begins. And the moment that search for uniformity begins, you start also searching for an instinctive ownership of everything. That we as a community own certain things. Since late 19th and early 20th century, therefore, the project which I have earlier described conceptually as the project of majoritarianism had already emerged. We are discussing that project today only because it has now gathered weight, it has gained prestige and political salience. But let us not forget that the project has already been there. This contestation was always there. And therefore, the majoritarian narrative has also begun a century ago, just when the salad bowl strategy had begun to evolve instinctively among Indian politicians. So, just at the time when Indian politicians were sort of breaking their heads to find out how to deal with this question of diversity, and they hit upon the idea of diversity and at the same time nationalism, the discomfort emerged and a counter narrative also emerged in the form of majoritarianism. Obviously, as I said earlier, there are not one but many majoritarianisms. I am not reserving the term majoritarianism only to its present all India manifestation in the form of Hindu nationalism, because all of us, whether we live in Assam or Maharashtra, we have witnessed regional majoritarianisms. We do witness regional majoritarianisms even today. Those who have witnessed how the Punjabis, before the creation of Haryana, constructed a majority of the Punjabi speaking people, would realize how majoritarianism had worked even in the processes of formation of our states. All our state agitations were in a sense supported by one form of majoritarianism or the other. So there are majoritarianisms and majoritarianisms, but over the period of time, obviously we always have had one particular majoritarianism which had the largest political purchase in the Indian context, and that is why that majoritarianism sort of overwhelms all other majoritarianisms of Indian recent past. It is in this manner that the Hindu majoritarian narrative has emerged as a superlative narrative, which sometimes is at odds with the local majoritarianisms, sometimes negotiates and compromises with local majoritarianisms, amalgamates them, makes them part of its larger narrative, and goes on. The history of this majoritarianism, the larger majoritarianism, which I have called as the Hindu majoritarianism, this history is can be broadly divided into three phases. And I'm just flagging off those phases because I am aware that many of the members of the audience are well acquainted with that history. For my convenience, however, I would say that this history of past more than 100 years of majoritarianism in India falls into three parts. The first part is roughly up till 1970, and these periodizations are always rough. Why do I say that it is up till 1970? One part, because the emphasis then of majoritarianism was only on cultural focus. There was a focus on cultural rejuvenation, cultural reconstruction, culturally constructing a narrative and popularizing that. It was more inward looking, and also it was practically apolitical in the sense of formal governmental politics. So 1970. The next phase begins around 1970 when it almost drops the first emphasis and picks up on the second, which is politics. So this project of majoritarianism then becomes a straight away political project, a political post since 1970 onwards, continues to be so, even at the cost of bypassing, keeping aside, or giving less importance to the cultural focus. So between 1970 and almost till recently, there was this politics or political focus of majoritarian politics in the sense of party politics and getting control over state power, governmental power. So since the 70s till the early 2000s, we have had this second phase of majoritarian politics. Finally, then we enter into the third phase contemporarily, which is more well-rounded, which is more confident, and because it is more confident, it engages with both these arenas, the cultural and the political, with equal strength, with equal aplomb, and equal penetration in the society. Over these 100 years, but particularly over the past 3-4 decades, what has happened is that it has now gained the ability to have this two-pronged politics, the politics of culture and the politics of state control or state power. It's a long history how all this has happened. We probably cannot go into the entire history today, and therefore I would just give you a clue as to how over 100 years this has become possible. But before we attribute merits to the project, saying that it is their credit that they have gained strength, let us go back to the paradox that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that democracies always have this possibility, this propensity to become slaves of majorities. All democracies have this propensity. If majority is there, then democracy has a propensity to fall prey to that majority of a particular group. In fact, therefore, democracies have always to be very wary of community majorities or group majorities of a frozen or permanent kind. In India also, as I mentioned, right since the beginning of the 20th century, the majoritarian proclivities were already there. So it is not that somebody brought this rabbit out of a hat only in a particular year. The rabbit was already there, and we were trying to hide that rabbit. We were probably trying to keep it tamed, and that rabbit then became a tiger. That is how majoritarianism has evolved politically over time. Of course, party politics has contributed to that. Of course, the problems of various kinds that India has faced have contributed to that, but that should not take away the ability, tenacity, and perseverance of the majoritarian politics to sustain itself for 100 years. If we are worried about majoritarian politics, then probably it would be a grave mistake to attribute its success to other elements rather than its own ability to win and gain success in Indian context in the past 4 decades or 5 decades. What has happened then in last 3-4 decades is that India's political majoritarianism has shown a very extreme kind of flexibility of ideological nature. It has also shown capacity to expand socially. So there has been social expansion, there has been ideological fluidity, and then above all, strategically, I would identify one factor as the most critical factor in the spread of majoritarianism in past 4 decades, which is the capacity or the ability to convert people's private religiosities into public symbolisms. This is extraordinary. People are always religious all over the world, not just in India. 99% people are always religious, God-fearing, believers, etc. Everyone has his or her religion and ideas of religion. It is this capacity of India's project of majoritarian politics to convert this private personal religiosity into a political capital. That has happened now. It has become a symbol, and that symbolism now constitutes our politics. So to proclaim who I am in terms of my religious persuasion doesn't remain a matter of faith, an act of faith or an act of worshipping the God, but an act of politics. I do my duty to my nation by proclaiming my faith if I were a Hindu. It is this conversion of personal private religiosity into a political capital which needs to be probed further, which needs to be teased out if we want to understand how this all happened. And obviously, this happened over time. Having happened then, what are the prospects of India's democratic politics now? Today, for past some years, this has happened. As I said, a two-pronged majoritarian politics is now happening around us in the society, in the state sphere, in the constitutional sphere, etc., etc. As a result of that, what are the possibilities now? Let us be clear about certain facts. Some have evidence, some might not have concrete statistical evidence. But let us be clear that there is a critical proportion of India's population which supports, not just condones, but supports the politics of majoritarianism, either fully or in part. And since, as I said earlier, I have been tracking this for last decade and a half, when I started tracking how many people support majoritarianism, barely 3 out of every 10 were supporting crass majoritarianism. There are various varieties, but a crass majoritarianism, that is to say, 3 out of 10 believed that because a community is in majority, it has claims over everything in the public domain. 3 out of 10 thought so around 2004. Then today, that is to say 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, today, out of 10, that is 1 out of every 2 Indians believes in this. So I would argue, let us not go into these details, technical details, maybe in questions and answers I can come back to that, that there is a critical mass of support to majoritarian proposition in the first place. Add to that, secondly, a critical proportion who is ready to look the other way. They won't mind. They would say that we don't mind what this government or this regime does by way of majoritarian politics, so long as they do something else in the realm of defense or in the realm of economy or in the realm of global power, whatever. You can find uses to that. But the point is that while a critical mass supports openly the majoritarian politics, another critical mass is ready to look the other way. And that is how the active proportion of those who would actively support the salad bowl analogy has actually shrunk. It is very small now. And therefore, this is what India's politics today looks like. That India's democratic politics would be run, conducted on the terms of majoritarian politics. Even if you want to oppose it, you have to actually oppose it only on its own terms and its own language. That's one. The second point that is likely to happen is this, that electoral majorities will more and more overlap with majoritarian politics. That is to say, in simple words, the majoritarian politics will always convert itself into electoral majority nationally and at the state level also. And that is therefore, in a sense, I have been calling this as the new phase of the second hegemony that India is facing. If the early hegemony was the so-called hegemony of the salad bowl, now is the hegemony of majoritarian politics. So all politics will then be within that framework. As a result of this, more seriously, and please don't misunderstand me while I am sort of saying how great political majoritarianism been in its success, I am aware of its pitfalls and grave dangers to democracy. That is why I am calling it a very successful project. That the dangers are now so near us, so close us, that it has been successful. So what happens then as a grave danger to democracy is that electoral and other politics apart, there would be the corrosion of the idea of political equality, which is at the basis of democracy, that every person and every group are politically equal. This fundamental principle of democracy is no more accepted in the public realm. It is going to corrode. Today, of course, laws are there, but tomorrow, even those laws would be delegitimized. And therefore, there would be a corrosion of political equality. Consequently, our institutions will be unable to ensure fairness across communities. Already, there are always grumblings and complaints about that fairness. But increasingly now, the institutional infrastructure to protect fairness or ensure fairness will have collapsed, will have gone. And that is the other political fallout, which is very dangerous to democracy. But above all, and that is where I would turn to the concluding part of my presentation now, what happens to democracy in this entire environment of majoritarianism is one simple thing, and that is an environment of suspicion emerges. Suspicion of whoever is labeled as the other. There is a suspicion, and then this environment engulfs us. It leads to public unreason. This is a clumsy word. I am deliberately using it as a trial. What happens is that the environment of suspicion, distrust, produces public unreason. There is an unreasonableness in our public sphere today, and that unreasonableness is going to only grow. Here is the catch. The catch is that democracy is always based on the hope that public reason is possible. All democracies always keep hoping that public reason is possible and that public reason can produce harmony and well-being. That is what public reason is expected to be doing. One, harmony, and two, well-being. This is the presupposition of democratic politics. So my puzzlement, my question to all of you would be this: what would happen if we lose public reason and we lose even the possibility of public reason. If democracy is based on public unreason, then the politics of majoritarianism alone can flourish. So where do we go from here? That is the question. This is a question which requires prognosis, but which also requires a lot of courage, either to be optimistic or to be pessimistic, either way. Frankly, I am not sure where we are headed to. But just to tease out some discussion out of this August gathering, I would make 3 possibilities as my suggestions to you. The first would be, from here we go on to become a bad America, a Hindu nation where everyone is welcome on terms. And bad America is not something as a bad dream, but something which is already unfolding on the soil of the United States currently. So we can become that. Now, this means that many institutions might occasionally fight back, and therefore political equality might not be fully lost, and therefore spaces for politics of a democratic kind may still be there till, for example, one critical judge of the Supreme Court of the United States dies, for instance. Till then, there is hope. The moment she dies, the balance tilts, but the space therefore is there. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is that we would straight away become Israel. And that's why I have given this reference to Sami Smuha, who has in fact studied and he specializes on the ethnic democracy of Israel. He calls it the model of ethnic democracy, Israel. And then he goes on to study many other countries also. So you formalize the secondaryness of the others, you formalize the primaryness of a particular community, and then live happily ever after. So that's the second possibility. The third would be we could simply become Sri Lanka. You don't have to travel so far away to United States or even to Israel. Nearer home, you can become a Sri Lanka. That is to say, you can have a combination of majoritarianism and authoritarianism in the garb of national politics. Roads are open. It is always known that democracies in their trajectories and histories always go through forks. And at the fork point, what choices democracies make, what choices peoples inhabiting those democracies make become historical choices. They become historical because they can take democracy into an abyss or they can ensure that democracy survives. India probably is at such a fork. In the short run, in the next 10 years' time, I suspect that we would have 2 features. Whichever way we might go ultimately, we would have 2 features. One would be that our democracy would be truncated, it would be cut short, it would shrink, and our diversity, of which we are proud, or I am proud, would be punctured. Like a punctured tire of a vehicle, there would be the skeletal picture of our diversity. The soul of that diversity would be gone. The diversity would be, in a sense, punctured. My worry is that in the next 10 years' time, therefore, majoritarian politics would do these 2 things. It would cause the truncating of democracy and the puncturing of diversity. But ironically, it would also be the justification for doing all that. Because democracies have this extraordinary capacity of killing its own produce. Like revolution, it's not just revolutions, democracy also can kill its own produce. And the fork that I talked about is dangerous and fearful precisely because of this, that India's democracy might just as well eat itself out. I'm sorry for this negative prognosis, but that is where I would like to stop. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, sir. I think, as always, after listening to Professor Palshikar, sir, it takes some time to kind of absorb it all. I think Mrs. Kelkar wanted to say something. So we can't hear you.
Yes, probably to unmute himself.
Yeah.
No,
That was fantastic, really fantastic. As I said, I didn't want to be seen, but I was listening to you. Prashant, there should be some way of an applause that we could give. Although
yeah, I know
it's
the technology does wonderful things. I'm sure there would be one
technology.
tool that would come up soon.
You can have a simulated applause.
Yeah.
We should be able to give him a big applause. A big hand.
IPL is doing it, Prashant. They must find
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So we have a few questions now. So if I could take the question and answer, and thereafter we'll go to Dr. Kelkar for his concluding remarks. So I'll take a few questions, sir. Here is what I'll do. I'll read out some questions. I'll do a couple of them at a time so that you can pick and choose and which ones you take to respond. As I got the job, so I'm just going to read the questions as is rather than giving them, rewarding them in any fashion. First one is Palshikar sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes, please go ahead. I was just trying to jump so that I don't forget and ask you to repeat. Please go ahead.
Sure. So there is a question about, are the concepts of Jewish democracy or Hindu democracy conceptually tenable, defensible? That's one question. There is another one about the first past the post system. So the FPTP electoral system and its tendency towards majoritarianism, if any, and possibility of electoral reforms. So does the FPTP have tendency towards majoritarianism? I think there was an APW article on this topic. The third, and I'll stop there after this question, is how much is Gandhiji's idea of village republic is now relevant in present context of COVID situation? So you could pick and choose the relevant questions. So I'll leave it to you, sir, and then I'll go through the next set of questions.
Thank you. On the tenability of the concepts, there seems to be, since I mentioned Smuha, there seems to be some element in his argument to say that rather than having no democracy at all, it is good that there would be at least some democracy in ethnic democracy, and that's why he calls it ethnic democracy. I'm not sure about that. In the Indian context, the same argument has been made by another scholar based at Nottingham, Catherine Adney. She also believes that rather than having no democracy at all, at least having majoritarian democracy or ethnic democracy might not be a bad idea. Personally, if you ask me, I am extremely skeptical about this for reasons that I mentioned at the end. That such democracies, ethnic democracies, tend to cut at the roots of what democracy stands for. And therefore, I am not sure that this is possible. The second question was about FPTP, and I must say that on this question of electoral mechanism, I am rather inclined to believe that processes trump structures or institutions. In other words, in a society like India, it's not FPTP that we need to blame if there is majoritarianism. As we all know, even otherwise, the majority party or majority tendency of FPTP got neutralized the moment party system became more competitive around 1990. If you look at the seats and votes shared by different political parties, you will find that some kind of equity arose during that time, not because the structure forced that, but because for the simple reason, politics became more competitive. Now, what would happen to the majoritarianism that I am talking about? If you have FPTP and if, let's say, all Hindus vote for the same party, which they don't, and till today they have never voted to the same party. All Hindus never voted for the same party. But if they voted, then you have majoritarianism of a very strong kind. On the other hand, you have proportional representation by proportion of each community, you still have that Hindu majoritarianism. And therefore, I am not so sure. I would bet my money instead on the reasonability of the Hindu voter to realize that his or her being Hindu has less to do with which party she or he votes. That is something that we need to hope for. The third is an interesting question. I would duck it, however, not being directly related to the topic of the lecture today.
Sure, sir. Here are a couple more. Now this is provocative one, and I'll read it as is. Have the liberals, so to say, lost the plot? Why is there no alternative that is coming up? That's one question. The second one, and I'll take these two together. Would how? I mean, I'm paraphrasing the question now. What would be the curve of the progress of majoritarianism if there is a regime change at the center? And another one that's connected to it, I don't have numbers, but I'm reading the question. Given the reduced number of representatives from regional parties in the Lok Sabha, is India going towards two-party system? So I think I'll stop there and I'll take up a couple more after that, sir.
Right, quickly for the third question, because it is of a more technical nature. Yes, it is true that between 2014 and 2019, there has been a slight depletion in the share of representatives of the state parties or the regional parties. The only reason why I don't think, therefore, we are turning towards a two-party system is simply because there is not even the second party of the two-party system. So what we are turning to is the older picture of one-party dominance where you have multi-party competition. So many parties of roughly equal strength competing with each other. The first two parts of the question or the first two questions are actually more critical to what we have been discussing. And again, I would begin with the latter question there. Would there be, what would happen if there is a regime change? That was the question, right? In a sense.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Now, I would believe strongly that not much will change, and yet very important changes can happen if regime change happens at the center. That is because state power of the Indian state being such, if one loses or gains control over state power, it would make a huge difference to what other politics then happen. And therefore, the question was, if I recall, what would be the curve of majoritarianism? My answer would be that curve would become very cruel, but politically less effective. It would become cruel, but politically less effective. And therefore, a single line answer to the original question, have liberals lost the plot? I think it would be in all modesty and honesty necessary that liberals agree that they have lost the plot, not in 2014. And that is what I would like to rub in. That 2014 is only a dramatic manifestation. The liberals probably lost the plot much, much, much earlier, probably not even in 1990. So they have lost the plots again and again, because the plot here is actually relate your principles and ideals to actual politics. And that failure since probably 1970s has been the major loss of the liberals, whoever they are. Because these days anyone can be or cannot be called a liberal. So we'll leave it at that.
True. Thank you, sir. I'll take up another couple of these now. So I think to some extent you talked about this, but there is this question about the institutional factors or processes that influence majoritarianism in both ways, positively, negatively. So institutional factors or processes that influence majoritarianism, which ones do? The second one is about leadership. Possibly there is a connect in the question about strong leader and majoritarianism. The question says, how do we work on stronger institutions as against strong leader that majority is expecting to have? The next one and last one here is, the role played, what in your view the caste, feminist and all other struggle as movement play role in changing the tide of majoritarianism? So that's the question I'm reading. So I'll read it again. What in your view the caste, feminist and all other struggle as movement play role in changing the tide of majoritarianism? Thank you, sir.
I think the first two are actually more fascinating questions, but the third is theoretically challenging. You know, what happens is that democracy means actually that you create institutions, you invest energy into those institutions, and then you let them run democracy. Democracy is less about personal whims, though of course popularity of a leader would play an important role in democracy given what democracy is. Therefore, as I said, among the many puzzlements of democracy, this is a paradoxical puzzle that democracy requires institutions, democracy also requires leaders, but leaders don't like institutions often, and therefore they tend to undermine institutions. Individuals, leaders undermine institutions. In the Indian context, therefore, the most important institutions that have failed India's democracy are the bureaucracy and the police. Judiciary, poor institution, is always in the limelight. And if I criticize the judiciary, I might have to pay a fine. So I will not do that. But in my honest opinion, more than judiciary, because you don't go to the judiciary every day, finally. Judiciary plays a historical cataclysmic role in protecting institutional framework. But on a daily basis, it is the police and the civil bureaucracy which are the major institutions of democracy, and whether it is emergency of 1975 or whether it is today, it is these two institutions which have been stripped naked of any institutional nicety, procedure and fairness. Just nothing. And therefore, if you ask me where the blame lies as far as institutions are concerned, I will not blame the politician. I will not blame the political parties. I will blame these institutions as institutions. Does a strong leader undermine institutions? Yes, of course. As I said, a strong leader would always gain strength only by undermining institutions, particularly if she or he is a leader of a particular variety. There are leaders and leaders, but leaders who are particularly keen on various aspects of demagoguery and creation of public unreason. Because there are leaders who can also create public reason, and if leaders don't want to create public reason, then they would have a kind of antagonistic relationship with institutions. I'm sorry, the third question I will cut short the answer simply because you will need to have some expert to actually speak at length on this third question. Frankly, my opinion is that the way anti-caste and feminist movements evolved in India, and I'm not blaming the movements, I'm saying the way in which they evolved, they practically overlooked the larger problem that India has had and was going to have. It is easy, of course, for me to blame them retrospectively today. But if you look at their language and their assertions even today, you will find that they have not learned anything, even from last 4 decades of failures. But anyway, I would need a more critical elaboration later sometime and reflection on this.
Thank you so much, sir. So if you allow, I'll just take one last question and then I'll be requesting Dr. Kelkar. So last question, I'll read it as is. As a right of center thinker, so the question says, as a right of center thinker, one might say there are numerous upsides to majoritarianism as well, especially in terms of the market economies. Your thoughts, sir?
Really tough to answer, but therefore, and not as a quarrel, I would begin by saying that this right and left business is also redundant actually. Because here right would obviously mean, right of center would obviously mean that you have a center. My argument is that for last 2 decades at least, the center itself has moved away. And since the center has moved away, you don't have to be right of the center, you have just to have grab that middle ground. But then, having said this, my problem with this proposition is that whether it really supports, whether being right of center in this sense, majoritarian sense, does it support whatever is meant by neoliberal economy? I am not so sure. I am at all not convinced that there is a necessary nexus between community-based rightism, that is to say majoritarianism, and neoliberal economics. I can very well imagine liberals being neoliberals in economics. So you don't have to be a neoliberal in social matters in order to be a neoliberal in economics as well. And in fact, poor neoliberals in India, they have really been frustrated in last 5-6 years. They not only voted for the present regime, but also upheld the present regime on grounds of neoliberal economy. And at the end of 6 years, what they have got is there is neither neoliberal economy nor liberal politics which they cherish. So I really feel bad about them.
Thank you so much for all your answers, sir. I think now we'll request Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Vice President of Pune International Center, to please give his concluding remarks.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So first, let me congratulate Professor Palshikar, absolutely brilliantly analytical lecture on extremely important political issues which the country is facing. You know, Professor Palshikar, normally when economists talks about economic policies, they say you have forgotten politics. So I'm afraid I have to say same thing about your lecture. That
Yes.
I would mention a couple of economic factors which may explain the dynamics which you're mentioning, and that's why I'm a little more optimistic of reversal of the dynamics. So I do believe that the two factors are probably explain this periodicalization which you have done. One is, of course, the process of demographic dominance of above the Vindhyas, north of Vindhyas, and below south of Vindhyas. And that's a tremendously important in to understand the politics of it, because the forces which are operating right now are really come to fore because of dominance, demographic dominance of north of Vindhyas, and which is which led to this more sort of Hindutva dominance really coming because of that factor, while south of Vindhyas is much less absent. And I think that's what probably will, and that's the future. I'm saying south of Vindhyas tells the future of India, not what is happening north of Vindhyas. So this is one proposition. Second, I think you will notice that there is probably a very close relationship between rise of Hindutva with the process of urbanization. The earlier, I think Indian peasantry bought the nationalist movement's approach to diversity. And that was really the genius of Gandhiji, that he created, and Congress model or Congress essentially created in our peasantry acceptance of Indian diversity and democracy. But the urbanization process, increased urbanization, really broke that. So these are two processes which are probably you're seeing the manifestation of what's happening. I don't think it's a permanent manifestation. I do believe that it's reversible. And to me, the south of India's processes give me great hope that our original enterprise or what our original project of democracy is not lost yet. And there is a fourth possibility which you mentioned. You gave three, so there's a fourth possibility. Just look at what's happening in south of India, and that will get replicated all over India. I will capture again model of that unity with diversity kind of syncretic kind of model. So, and this is where economic forces are going. And I'll add one more factor, which is economic process. I think the open economy, which is now India is going through, you cannot have closed minds with open economy. And somehow they're incongruent. And closed economy is not possible to India's future. So given the openness in the Indian economic system, which is emerging compared and which is irreversible, I believe that will lead to openness in the minds, and which means openness in sort of kind of the vision of Gandhiji or Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, and that kind of very, very inclusive and sort of integrated or syncretic view of Indian democracy. So maybe there's a fourth way, not necessarily three way, which you mentioned. Maybe we yet have possibilities of recapturing the unique model, and we did not follow neither Israel, nor Turkey, nor the United States, or Sri Lanka. We'll do again our own way. Very probably, very, very. I mean, it is a, as you would argue, it is a contingent possibility. I'm not saying this will happen, but to borrow your language, a contingent possibility. But I still believe that I will not rule it out completely. But once again, let me thank you. Absolutely brilliant lecture, and we'll bring it out if you permit. As a separate sort of paper, so it's available for people, and we can see, and we'll of course put it on our website. And I want to thank all the participants. I'm told by Prashant that we have this time a record number of participants in terms of as a lecture. So you have given this new record to us in terms of in this mode. So I thank you from my behalf and entire PIC community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mashelkar. Once again, on behalf of PIC, President, the Vice President, the trustees who have joined, the members, and all Punekars who attend these programs, my colleagues, Abhay Vaidya, Associate Director, my other colleagues in office, on behalf of all of us, thank you so very much, sir, for this very scholarly lecture. We look forward to go through it again and again as it's recorded and it's there on the YouTube for everyone to see. Many, many thanks for your time, and look forward to see you again and hear you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, I now announce that we conclude the 10th Foundation Day program of Pune International Center. Thank you.